On August 2007, police received the call that they had been waiting for.
Oh, hi, look, I'm just wanting to report that missing car for the mother that's missing.
I'm 1CDS564. Was that on the news, was it?
Yes, it was. It's that the Raina woman, which is missing for over a week.
The vehicle of missing woman, Corinne Rainey, had been located. The car was found broken down, caused by a significant oil leak from the car hitting something. This oil leak would be the key to finding Corinne Rainey. Police followed the trail of oil to nearby bushland in Kings Park. There, buried upside down and in a deep grave, was the body of wife and mother, Corinne Rainey. Shortly after, her husband, Lloyd Rainey, was announced as the prime and only suspect.
Lloyd, did you kill your wife?
No, I didn't.
Hi guys, and welcome to Koala Crimes, an Australian true crime podcast. I'm your host, Samantha Melanie, and today we are going to be discussing one of the most talked about cases out of Perth. I would say that this case is up there in notoriety with the Claremont serial killer and the Bernies or the Morehouse murders. Mind you, I don't think it's that well known out of Perth or Western Australia. So today's story is the classic, did the husband do it? That's the million-dollar question. But before we get into it, a quick reminder that all the visuals for this episode will be up on my Instagram feed and highlights, and the video version will be up on my YouTube channel in about 1 week. All those links will be in the show notes. And if you do find value in my content, please consider leaving a review, rating the pod, subscribing, or sharing it with a friend. Having said all of that though, let's get into the case of Corinne Rainey. So we're heading back to the year of 2007 in Perth, Western Australia. There lived 44-year-old Corinne Veronica Ann Rainey. Corinne was born in Uganda in 1963 before moving to Australia with her family in 1973. After graduating high school, Corinne went on to study law and went on to work for the Commonwealth Government and the Western Australian Government. By 2007, she was working as a registrar at the Supreme Court of Western Australia, a registrar being someone involved in case management and pre-trial work. In 1990, Corinne married Lloyd Rainey, who we will discuss in one moment, and they went on to have 2 girls, Caitlin born in 1994 and Sarah born in 1997. Friends and family described Corinne as friendly, bubbly and outgoing, although she could apparently be incredibly stubborn at times. My overall impression on what I read on Corinne was that she was the life of the party. Enjoyed getting out there, being sociable, trying new things and making new friends. She also appeared to be a very smart woman that had worked very hard to get where she was. The Raineys lived in the suburb of Como and by all accounts, at least from the outside, they were a happy and normal family. Now let's talk a little bit about Corinne's husband, Lloyd Rainey. Lloyd Patrick Rainey was born in Aden, Yemen in 1962 before moving to Australia with his family when he was 5 years old. Like Corinne, Lloyd also studied law after high school and was practicing by 1984. Over the years, Lloyd worked at a number of law-related jobs, including working for the Office of the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions, the Western Australia Crown Solicitor's Office, and the WA Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, or DPP, as a prosecutor. There were a few mouthfuls. In 2003, Lloyd was offered the position of Senior Crown Counsel of the DPP in Bermuda, which he accepted. But this of course meant he was going to spend some time away from his family. Lloyd was away for a total of 18 months before returning to live with his family in Perth and continue working in law. As you may have gathered by now, the Raineys were very well-known members of the law community in Western Australia, both considered intelligent and hard-working individuals. Those that knew Lloyd both personally and professionally described him as calm, quiet and reserved. So quite the opposite to his wife, but I suspect it was Lloyd and Corinne's similar life paths that drew them together more than their personalities. Lloyd was also really good under pressure, which I suspect made him a very good lawyer. And as I'm sure you can probably tell, he was very career-driven as well. Lloyd had worked hard to get where he was, and he was very proud of his profession and everything that he had achieved. So we've talked about Lloyd and Corinne separately. Now I want to talk about their relationship. In short, leading up to 2007, their marriage had been having a lot of problems and they were headed for a divorce. From what I can tell, the couple had been unhappy with each other since the birth of their second daughter in 1997, but their problems really began in 2000 when Lloyd entered into an extramarital affair with another woman. In 2003, Lloyd moved to Bermuda where the cheating continued. During this time period of Corinne living just with herself and the girls, she apparently flourished, with those that knew her saying it was the happiest that she had ever been. By all accounts, Corinne was not excited for her husband's return. When Lloyd was in Bermuda, Corinne found out that he had been unfaithful to her, but she also learned of another problem facing their marriage. Lloyd's gambling problem. When Corinne confronted Lloyd about the gambling problem and asked to see his financial records, he refused. This led Corinne to become very concerned about their family's financial situation. This, along with the infidelity, made Corinne lose all trust in her husband and all faith in their marriage. As it turned out, between 1997 and 2007, Lloyd had gambled away over $115,000 through TAB and CentreBet accounts. Now that does sound like a lot of money, but if we put it into perspective, that is about $11,500 a year, about $1,000 a month, and less than $250 a week. If we consider what the Raineys' combined income was, given their careers, it is a lot to gamble away, but it's not a crazy amount. Still, considering that Lloyd refused to hand his financial records over to his own wife, I'm sure this did not look good to her. Despite the cheating, the gambling, and their apparent non-existent sex life, Lloyd and Corinne kept up appearances for several more years, appearing at events together and even going on holidays, driven to at least make it work for their two young daughters. There is obviously a lot more to the Raineys' marriage breakdown that could be a podcast episode in itself. This is just the condensed version laying out the bare facts. In reality, we don't really know what goes on in anyone's marriage. By June of 2007, Lloyd and Corinne had pretty much called it quits on their marriage. They were still living together but sleeping in separate bedrooms and heading for a potentially messy divorce. During the next several months, the pair bickered, and at some point, Corinne threatened to expose Lloyd's dodgy work practices, which we'll get into soon, and in turn, she would destroy his career. A career, as I mentioned before, that he had worked so hard at and was so proud of. Scared of his wife's threats and in an effort to stay one step ahead of her, Lloyd purchased phone tapping equipment that allowed him to record and save both ends of a telephone conversation, which is of course illegal if all parties involved are not aware, which of course they were not. This equipment, which cost Lloyd a couple of $1,000s, was set up on their home telephone, back when those existed. During these calls, Corinne described Lloyd as a wicked man who had been sleeping with other women behind her back for years. She also said that her husband often accepted shonky deals from clients. Also around this time, Lloyd and Corinne had been consulting with their own separate lawyers regarding the divorce, and in one of her last emails to her lawyer, Corinne said, "We need to turn up the heat. I am living with a snake, well known in legal circles as a snake. It is intolerable," end quote. Corinne was also still trying to get a hold of her husband's personal financial records, as she feared he was hiding something from her, but Lloyd still refused. The only thing that they did seem to agree on was that Corinne would stay in the marital home with the girls and that Lloyd would move out. With financial ruin and career-ending threats on the table, no doubt Lloyd was getting nervous about this impending divorce. So he proposed to Corinne that they both sit down together with no lawyers present and calmly and amicably discuss this divorce, for the sake of their daughters, if nothing else. Corinne agreed, and they set aside Tuesday, August 7 to sit down and have a chat after Corinne's boot scooting class that evening. So let's talk about the events that happened on that day, August 7. At 7:30 p.m, Corinne drove herself to her usual Tuesday night boot scooting class at the Bentley Community Centre. Her oldest daughter, Caitlin, who was 13 at the time, was taken out to a concert that evening by family friend Shana Russell, and her youngest daughter, Sarah, who was just 10, was home with her father. Corinne's boot scooting class finished up at around 9:30 p.m. She waved goodbye to her friends and headed towards her vehicle parked in the centre's car park. What happened after that is largely unknown. What we do know is that Corinne had planned to head home after her boot scooting class and discuss the divorce with Lloyd, but she never made it home. The only thing that we do know for certain is that somewhere between the centre car park and her home in Como, Corinne Rainey went missing. Back home, Sarah went to bed somewhere between 9:30 and 10 p.m, meaning she would have likely missed her mother arriving home anyway. Between 10:30 and 11 p.m, Caitlin was dropped off from the concert. Lloyd was awake when Caitlin got home, and he actually invited Shana, the family friend, inside, but she declined and went home. Shana did notice that Corinne's car was not in the driveway, indicating to her that Corinne had not been home at the time. Caitlin went to bed at around 11:30 p.m. and fell asleep at around midnight. Assuming that Corinne had gone out with friends after her boot scooting class and that their planned meeting would be rescheduled, Lloyd also went to bed. The next morning, Lloyd woke up at around 7:30 and also woke his daughters up to take them to school. He did note that Corinne was not home, but he assumed that she had gone into work early. As they were no longer sharing a bed, Lloyd wasn't aware that Corinne had not made it home the previous evening. I'm going to assume that although Lloyd and Corinne did continue to live together, they weren't exactly communicating unless they had to, and they were pretty much staying out of each other's business, which would explain why he didn't notice Corinne was absent the night before. Lloyd dropped his girls off at school that morning and then headed to work at around 8:30 a.m. From that point onwards, Lloyd was in the company of work colleagues for his entire day. And no one that saw him that day noted any changes in his behaviour. Over at Corinne's workplace, her colleagues became concerned when the usually very reliable registrar failed to turn up for work. So they contacted Lloyd and informed him of the situation. Lloyd immediately knew that something was wrong because he, of all people, knew just how out of character this was for Corinne. He soon contacted the police and reported her as a missing person. Over the next week, Corinne's disappearance featured pretty heavily in the media. A mother, wife, and respected member of the community had vanished into thin air after a fun boot scooting class, leaving behind not a shred of evidence. It didn't sound good, and as the days passed, both the public and the police feared the worst. During this time, Lloyd remained fully cooperative with the police, giving them access to his home, computer, emails, anything that they asked for. He also assisted by phoning friends, family, and local hospitals in an effort to find his estranged wife. As well as Corinne being missing, her vehicle, a Ford Fairmount, had also vanished. Police thought that if they located the car, then they would find Corinne. So a public plea was put out to anyone that had seen her vehicle. After all, it had to be somewhere. 1 week after Corinne went missing, police finally received the call that they had been waiting for.
Oh, hi, look, I'm just wanting to report that missing car that for the mother that's missing.
I'm
1 CDS 564.
Was that on the news, was it?
Yes, it was. It's that the Raina woman. She's missing for over a week.
Corinne's vehicle was found abandoned on Kershaw Street in Subiaco, which is about a 10-minute drive from where the Raineys live in Como. The car was actually found to have broken down there rather than being left there by choice, and this was because of significant damage to the transmission oil sump. Now look, I'm not even going to pretend to know what that is, but whoever last drove Corinne's car hit something. And it caused enough damage to make a lot of oil leak, and in turn it broke down. So because of the amount of oil that leaked, it created a trail. So naturally, investigators followed it. The trail led them to Kings Park, which was 3 kilometres or 1.8 miles away. Kings Park, by the way, is a large botanic garden and park here in Perth. In Kings Park, the oil trail stopped off a sandy bush track leading off Lovekin Drive called Wattle Track. And at the entrance of this track, they found a bollard that appeared to have been pushed over to prevent any access. A bollard, by the way, is just like a pole or a post. Investigators soon realised that the damage caused to Corinne's car was from someone driving over this bollard. So beyond this track was bushland, and this is where they found a disturbed patch of soil that had been covered over by foliage. Layer by layer, the soil was removed until eventually female human remains were uncovered. The remains were soon identified as belonging to Corinne Rainey. If it had not been for that oil leak, it is believed her remains may never have been found. So Corinne's remains were found in an interesting position. She was buried upside down, meaning she had been buried head first with her feet above her, closest to ground level. Because of this unusual positioning, it was also rather a deep grave. The digging and refilling of this grave was actually later reconstructed, and it was estimated it would have taken the average person about 1 hour to complete. This leads me to believe that her murder was thought out and planned. After all, time and effort were put into concealing her body. The reason it's believed that she was buried upside down, by the way, was to speed up the decomposition of her head and her neck, which is where some of her more serious injuries were located. Again, this demonstrates that the perpetrator at least had some knowledge of how to conceal a murder. She was also found buried in the clothing that she had worn to boot scooting class that evening. It was noted that her shirt was ripped and her jeans were unzipped, possibly indicating a sexual assault, although I believe this was never confirmed. Scuff markings and damage to her boots also showed that she may have been dragged at some point. And injuries to the back of her head and trauma to her invertebral discs indicated that Corinne had been attacked from behind. It was soon determined that Corinne died on the night that she went missing and was buried shortly after. So let's talk about what other evidence was found and try to reconstruct what happened to Corinne Rainey on August 7. Soil, seed pods, paint, plastic and brick particles were all found on Corinne's clothing and remains. Testing confirmed that these all came from her home in Como, not Kings Park. Therefore, we can conclude that Corinne did make it home from her boot scooting class and was attacked from behind in her front yard and rendered unconscious. The perpetrator then placed Corinne in the back seat of her own vehicle and began driving to Kings Park. Pollen was also found in Corinne's nasal passage, and this was found to be pollen from Kings Park, meaning that Corinne must have died near where she was buried, not at home. This will become a very important piece of the investigation later, but we'll get back into that soon. I also want to discuss the seed pods found on Corinne that came from a tree in her front yard. Basically, when the pods were tested, a bunch of forensic evidence was found on them that shouldn't have been on them, and forensic evidence that should have been on them wasn't. For example, because Corinne was buried, the soil that she was buried in got into everything. Yet these seed pods were clean of any of that soil or sand. This led some to believe that the seed pods had been buried there, or even that cross-contamination had occurred during testing. But this is just speculation, so take it with a grain of salt. After Corinne was buried, we know that whoever killed her took her car and began making their way out of Kings Park, but not before hitting that bollard and causing the oil leak, indicating that this perpetrator was likely stressed or in a rush, which I mean, after burying a body, I suspect anyone would be. So we can assume that Corinne's killer was planning to use her vehicle as a getaway car until it unexpectedly broke down a few minutes later. So how did her killer get away? On foot? By taxi? Stealing another car? Investigators looked into all of these possibilities. They checked CCTV, looked at taxi records from that night, and asked the public for their help, particularly those living on Kershaw Street, if they had seen anything or heard anything, because the car breaking down likely would have made quite a bit of noise, spluttering sounds and whatnot. But nothing was found. Under the cover of darkness, the perpetrator had got away. So there was one little piece of evidence found near the crime scene that some considered damning evidence against Lloyd Rainey, but I'll let you make up your own mind on that. Several days after Corinne disappeared, but before her body was found, members of the public found a dinner place card in Kings Park near where the burial site would eventually be found. The place card had text on both sides. On the back, written in capital letters with a blue marker, it said, "The Queen." And on the front side, printed in black text, was the name, Lloyd Rainey. When confronted with this evidence, Lloyd explained that the place card had come from a legal dinner that he had attended weeks earlier. The Queen was a reference to a celebrity guessing game that Lloyd and his colleagues had been playing at the dinner. Lloyd said he took his wife's car to this legal dinner, which would explain how the card ended up in Kings Park, but several people who attended the dinner said that Lloyd was in his own car. So exactly how did this card end up in Kings Park? Well, no one really knows. And what does the card being near the crime scene prove? Well, not a lot. It was an interesting find, but it didn't have much impact on the investigation. I think the media and the public took the dinner place card find a lot more seriously than the investigation ever did. 1 month after the murder of Corinne Rainey, Lloyd Rainey was arrested, but not for murder. He was arrested for phone tapping and recording private conversations, which I touched on at the start. The Raineys' home was raided, but the phone tapping allegations would never amount to anything. Not at that time, at least. Shortly after this arrest, at a police conference in regards to Corinne's murder, Senior Sergeant Jack Lee made an explosive statement. He named Lloyd Rainey as the prime and only suspect in his wife's murder. After this, all hell broke loose. Both the media and the public began treating Lloyd as though he was already guilty. And as someone that lives in Perth, I can confirm that public opinion veered very strongly towards his guilt. Let's keep in mind that at this time, there was no forensic proof that Lloyd had been involved in the murder, and no arrest had been made to do with that. The general consensus was, well, of course the husband did it. They were in the middle of a divorce. Who else would kill her? On top of that, the media and the public didn't think that Lloyd was acting like the grieving husband. His demeanour was too calm, too put together, almost cold. But I mean, he was a lawyer. He was basically trained to act cool under pressure. Regardless, I always get frustrated when cases like this happen and the media and the public accuse such and such a person of not acting like a grieving person should. Exactly what does a grieving husband, wife, child, or friend look like? I also want to make it clear that I am not defending Lloyd in any way, but trying to keep this episode as unbiased as humanly possible. I want you, dear listener, to be able to form your own opinion on what you think happened. Following the announcement that Lloyd was the prime and only suspect, the public began retaliating. The Rainey's house was egged, there were dead rows left in the front yard, and Lloyd was verbally and even physically attacked in public. In one instance, a woman approached Lloyd at a bar and dumped the contents of a sanitary bin over his head, which is beyond disgusting. No matter what you believe, someone is innocent until proven otherwise, and everybody deserves their day in court. Over the next several months, and years for that matter, the Rainey case became one of the most controversial and talked about cases in Western Australia, and probably one of the most widely covered cases since the Claremont killings of the 90s. I'd actually be intrigued to hear from any local Perth people, West Australians, or even Australians who remember when this case happened. What do you remember about it? I remember in my family, everyone thought that Lloyd was guilty. But let me know over on Instagram at Koala Crimes. Anyway, months and years passed and no arrest was made. Lloyd did remain the investigation's prime and only suspect. One may argue that this investigation suffered from a serious case of tunnel vision, focusing on one suspect, Lloyd, the entire time. So having said that, let's very briefly run through two other suspects that were but barely looked into. In 2007, Alan Mitchell Lacko, who is considered one of Western Australia's worst violent and sexual offenders, lived in apartments that overlooked the Bentley Community Centre, where Corinne did her boot scooting class every single Tuesday evening. Lacko also happened to use the community centre car park to conduct drug deals, so it's possible that he had seen Corinne around there. On the day that Corinne was murdered, Alan Lacko made a phone call from a phone booth just down the road from the Raineys' home. 8 days later, when Corinne was found, Lacko fled the state. 1 year later, police tracked him down in Sydney and began an investigation into his potential involvement in Corinne's murder. They found in his possession a map of Kings Park, where he actually used to work, and a map of the Supreme Court, where Corinne worked before her death. Then we have Lacko's cousin, Ivan Eads, also a violent and sexual offender from Western Australia. He also happened to live very near to the Raineys' home, walking distance in fact. Even more damning was a cigarette butt found outside the Raineys' home. It had Eads' DNA all over it. Lacko and Eads were both named persons of interest in Corinne's murder, but no charges were ever laid. In fact, no charges would be laid upon anyone until December of 2010, over 3 years after the murder. In what was a very public arrest near where his wife once worked, Lloyd Rainey was pulled over while driving and arrested for the willful murder of his wife, Corinne Rainey. He was soon charged, but he maintained his innocence. His 2 daughters, Sarah and Caitlin, stood by his side in support. In mid-2012, what the media labelled the trial of the decade began. Lloyd Rainey requested a judge-alone trial due to how much publicity the case had received, and this request was granted. As you can imagine, it was a long and complicated trial. I could probably spend hours talking about it, but I am not going to do that. Instead, I am just going to go over the state's theory, basically talking about how they believed Lloyd killed his wife, as well as adding a few discussion points along the way. So the state believes that Corinne arrived home from her boot scooting class at around 9:45 p.m. At this point, her youngest, Sarah, was asleep and Lloyd was awake. Upon arriving home, the state argues that Lloyd attacked his wife from behind in their front yard. When he thought that she was dead, he hid her body at the side of the house before proceeding to move her car from view so it wouldn't be visible when his eldest daughter, Caitlin, arrived home from her concert. This would give the illusion that Corinne never arrived home. Between 10:30 and 11, Caitlin arrives home, dropped off by a family friend, Shana Russell. Shana notes that Lloyd appears calm and relaxed as he usually does, so much so that he invites her inside, but she declines. She also noticed that Corinne's car was missing. If we are to accept the state's version of events, we can assume that Lloyd must have thought that Corinne was dead when he hid her body, or he was running a massive risk of her waking up. The pollen later found in her nasal passage proved that she couldn't have been dead at this point because she took her last breath in Kings Park. After Caitlin fell asleep around midnight, Lloyd set about disposing of his wife's remains. The state argues that he retrieved Corinne's car from wherever he hid it and brought it back to the house. He then placed Corinne's body across the back seat and drove to Kings Park. For reference, Lloyd weighed 67 kilos or 147 pounds, didn't work out, suffered from back problems, and was described as being in soft physical condition. Honestly, same. Basically, he was weedy. Corinne, on the other hand, weighed 78 kilos or 171 pounds. We can therefore assume that Lloyd would have significantly struggled to transport his wife if he was even capable at all. I'm roughly the same height and weight as Lloyd, minus a few pounds and centimetres, and I have a bad back, and let me tell you, I could not transport 78 kilos of dead weight. I know adrenaline can kick in situations like this, but I think Lloyd would have needed to have dragged Corinne's body to move her. This brings me to another point. The investigation did actually look for drag marks outside the Raineys' home, such as a disturbance to the moss on the bricks, but nothing was found. So it appears that whoever killed Corinne had to have picked up her body. In court, the scuff marks on her boots that were thought to be from dragging were not considered in the end enough proof that she was dragged at any point. The state then brings up the fact that Lloyd would have needed some kind of digging tool to dig such a deep grave. As it happened, Lloyd had actually lent out his own shovels to a friend who was still in possession of them at the time of the murder. So at some point, either before the murder or right after, he would have needed to obtain a shovel of some kind. And this digging tool used to dig the grave has never actually been found. So the physically soft Lloyd allegedly dug his wife's grave, buried her, and then hightailed it out of there, so fast that he ran over the bollard, causing the oil leak that led back to the grave. It was also revealed at the trial that where the car broke down, Kershaw Street, actually had several legal practitioners living on it that Lloyd was friendly with. So if he did break down there, he ran the risk of being recognised. After the breakdown, which was thought to be around 2:30 a.m, Lloyd proceeds to walk on foot back to his Como home. This walk would have taken him roughly 90 minutes to complete, meaning he got home at around 4 a.m. As I mentioned earlier, no witnesses or CCTV saw Lloyd Rainey on this venture. Lloyd then probably cleaned himself up, got a few hours of sleep, and then woke his girls up around 7:30 a.m. At around 8:30 he gets to work, where his colleagues say he was his usual self. If he had been out all night, at the very least he should have appeared tired. Not only was he acting like his normal self, but he showed no signs of being in any physical pain and had no visible cuts or bruises. In the days following Corinne's disappearance, a number of people encountered Lloyd, and none of them reported any unusual or uncharacteristic behaviour. A few other things touched on during the trial were some of Lloyd Rainey's dodgy law practices. Lying under oath and making false declarations were just some of the things he was found to have done. Still, this doesn't make him a murderer. The dodgy seed pod evidence that I mentioned earlier was also thrown out of court. In the end, there was simply no forensic evidence that proved Lloyd was the killer. This leaves us with the circumstantial evidence, which is not always enough to get a conviction. And of course, motive. In this case, a lot of motive. So, on November 1, 2012, Lloyd Rainey was found not guilty. Justice Martin stated in his judgment summary, "The case by the state is beset by improbabilities and uncertainties. Crucial evidence is lacking, and the absence of evidence tells strongly against the state. Endeavours by the state to fill gaps and explain away improbabilities are primarily no more than speculation without foundation or evidence." End quote. He also mentioned that he believed it was a narrowly focused and biased investigation. So let's briefly go over what has happened in the years since. In 2013, an appeal was made against the judge's decision, but it was dismissed and the not guilty verdict was upheld. In 2015, the phone tapping allegations came back to haunt him. Lloyd ended up being charged but was acquitted due to lack of evidence. The following year, Lloyd wins back his right to practice law, which he lost after being charged with willful murder. In 2017, Lloyd won a defamation case against the state of Western Australia after claiming being labelled the prime and only suspect in his wife's murder ruined his reputation. He was awarded $2.62 million in damages. In 2018, the phone tapping allegations really came back to bite Lloyd in the behind. The tribunal recommended that Lloyd Rainey be struck off as a lawyer, and by 2020, Lloyd was officially struck off as a lawyer. Struck off meaning he could no longer practice law. And now we're in 2021 and no one has been convicted for Corinne Rainey's murder. And from what I can tell, it is not an open investigation. So I don't tend to put my own thoughts into cases, and today won't be too much different. But I do want to leave you with a few final thoughts because it's almost impossible not to have an opinion on this case. So do I think Lloyd himself killed his wife? No. Do I think that he possibly hired someone else to do it? It's possible. The thing is, I just don't think this could have been a random attack. Why blitz attack a stranger outside of their home with no obvious motive and then take so much time to conceal the body? And let's not forget that Lloyd worked as a lawyer. Did he piss someone off? Is it possible that he was framed? Or does being a criminal lawyer mean that you know how to commit the perfect crime? Lloyd Rainey had every motive to kill his wife, but in the eyes of the law at least, he is an innocent man. In the end, a smart, intelligent and beautiful woman lost their life. 2 young girls lost their mother. A mother and father lost their daughter. We're all so focused on Lloyd Rainey, yet I'm afraid that the murder of Corinne Rainey may never be solved. But I want to thank you so much for being here and for listening to Corinne's story. And thank you for supporting this podcast. Go leave some koala emojis over on my Instagram if you made it to the end. And until next time, stay vigilant and stay safe.